Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 47. This time we're taking a break from our usual format to take a look at the last 12 months in the Doylean world. It's one of the great boons of our hobby that each year Conan Doyle seems to get more and more attention, whether that's adaptations or events or publications. And so we wanted to take some time to acknowledge that and to pick out some of our highlights.
Yeah, there was so much Doyle-related material and so many events last year that we've had to make a selection out of necessity. We're based in the UK, so we're more attuned to happenings here, but obviously this is a worldwide phenomenon, and we have tried to reflect that. We hope, anyway, that our selection proves of interest and may alert you to things you may have missed or wish to explore further.
Yep. So if you want to find out about any of the things that we're going to talk about, you'll find links in the show notes, which you can find at doingsofdoyle.com. So I think we'll get started with publishing and scholarship. I think we're blessed in this hobby that we've got a lot of great journals that are always producing material on Conan Doyle. So Canadian Holmes, Magic Door, Sherlock Holmes Journal, Baker Street Journal, of course. Recent addition to that's been things like a common newsletter from the ACD Society, which is reproducing the Blue John Gap manuscript. And, you know, Belanger Books have produced Steel True Blade Straight, which is a great annual that's now come out, 2 issues of that come out as well. But it does seem to be that Conan Doyle seems to be getting more interest, particularly from, I think, literary scholars.
Yeah, it's always been quite a difficult one this for years. Obviously, the whole Sherlock Holmes issue clouds things. But yeah, many years ago, I was heavily involved with the Northern Musgraves Society, and it was always a point with the Musgraves to bring Doyle in. We made a point of trying not to do too much game material. At the same time, you had Chris and Barbara Roden starting their early Conan Doyle Society. And so you got the stirrings back then. This was a bit early to mid 90s, and now things are really coming around to that viewpoint generally, where you have, as you pointed out, Canadian Holmes are doing a lot of this, and they're obviously tied into the Toronto Library, which has always been very strong on this issue. And as you said, with academia for many years, Doyle was a no-go area. But that is beginning to change, and the whole move in format and the understanding of writers as, to use that word which we also dread, influencers, is all starting to move into the discussion and the debate now, and Doyle is beginning to come out of the shadows somewhat and become less of a cartoon character than he used to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one of the major areas of development recently has been obviously the Edinburgh edition of the works of Conan Doyle. This is a project to essentially compile the sort of definitive text of Conan Doyle's major works. And we spoke to the general series editor, Douglas Kerr, back in episode 30. And last year, 2023, there were 2 new volumes came out. There was the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, edited by Jonathan Cranfield in March, which we talked to Jonathan about that in episode 39. And more recently, July, there was the Round Red Lamp, edited by Roger Luckhurst. And, I think we're starting to get a greater appreciation, not just of those texts and how they evolved, which is one of the things that the Edinburgh editions, I think, do really well, but also the commentary and the end matter is particularly good in those as well. So you get those rounded discussions about things like, why does the memoirs not include the cardboard box,
Mhm.
or why is it that the ending of the Curse of Eve changed?
Yeah, so you've got these nice tie-ins between the worlds of Sherlock Holmes and the world of Doyle's other writing, which is it's great to see this really coming to the fore now.
Mm,
I'm also, on a personal, I'm really delighted to see that this is coming out of the Edinburgh University Press.
yes, of course.
And it reflects the work of Edinburgh, particularly Owen Dudley Edwards
Yeah.
of Edinburgh University, and his pioneering work in this field, and his wonderful biography, The Quest for Sherlock Holmes, which I can't recommend enough, which came
Yeah.
out in 1983, where Owen was really pushing this
Mm,
sort of material, and it's now coming to fruition, that way of thinking, and this fully rounded view now of Doyle and Sherlock Holmes.
yes. Yeah.
It's wonderful to see this happening.
And that really connects us to the next of our highlights here, which is
Mm,
that there's now a new Oxford World Classics edition of Sherlock Holmes. The
mm,
original version, the 1990s version, was edited by Owen Dudley Edwards,
mm.
and there's now a new edition has come out. This time edited by Darryl Jones from Trinity College Dublin, who we really must get onto the podcast sometimes,
No, absolutely.
because he's an expert both in Gothic literature and another great passion of ours, which is M.R. James, and
Mhm.
we'll be returning to M.R. James later,
Oh,
and
yes.
that Oxford World Classics edition is really interesting because I think where Owen approached it from a kind of more historical perspective, perhaps, the new Oxford World Classics edition is bringing in more of the kind of modern literary studies take.
Mm.
So it's a while it's an updating, it's also it feels very complementary. It's not a direct replacement as such. It feels like it's actually moving us forward in a slightly different direction.
Oh, definitely. It's doing a different thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember the '93 issue coming out,
Mhm.
and it still feels quite recent to me, which is
Yes, it
but
does.
you've got this thing where we're talking 30 years ago now,
Mm.
so there is a time for an updating, but that's what these really are, updatings. They're not replacements, because
Yes.
it is, as you point out, a different way of looking at things. It's whereas, again, as you mentioned, with the original '93 team, there's you had Owen, who was an historian, W. Robson,
Yes, of course.
very eminent literary scholar,
Yeah.
also involved with and a great Sherlockian, as well as Chris Roden and Richard Lancelyn Green, who still years after his death is still, through his work, playing a role
Yes.
in the way that we're going with Doyle and Sherlock studies now, and this '93 issue showed the way to do this, and now with the new issue, we are, as you say, just getting this kind of update, and the newer scholarship coming in, the discoveries that have been made since, and
Yes,
there
of
have
course.
been a lot in the
Yes.
past 30 years. So this has to be reflected. So
Mm.
it's all good.
A good example of that actually is in the recent reappraisal of Conan Doyle as a Gothic writer, which really has taken off. I think in the last 20 years, the last 10 years, it's become a particular focus. I think, and when you read Darrell's introduction, in particular to the Hound, the new edition of the Hound, he does a really good job, I think, of wrestling with the fact that the Hound is actually a Gothic novel that
Mm,
Sherlock Holmes is then inserted into, and then
mm.
sometimes the joins are a bit clumsy. But the fact that actually you can bring out that the fact that it's such an incredible Gothic novel in and of itself, so
Oh,
much
yeah,
so that
yeah.
I mean, Christopher Frayling, was it in the '90s, was talking about the sort of four cornerstone Gothic works being Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and
Mm,
Hyde, and of course Hound of the Baskervilles as well.
mm, mm. And the Hound, I so always recommend it to someone who's never read any Sherlock Holmes. Where do you start? I always recommend they start with the Hound rather than studying Scarlet,
Yes.
because it's such a good book. I always make sure that I read it at least once a year, at least.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful work, and it is because of this richness of it being a detective story, a Gothic novel, and you then go back to its origins with Doyle's meeting with Bertrand Fletcher Robinson, and
Mm,
right from the start,
mm.
Doyle is referring it to as a real creeper.
Yeah.
So he just wanted to write this kind of, I think, a piece of Gothic escape, because he'd
Mm,
just come back from the Boer War, and the horrors of being a doctor in Bloemfontein in the typhoid
yeah.
epidemic there, and it's this kind of escape into the world of controllable Gothic horror,
Yes.
and that's all playing a part here.
Yes, I mean, and that's a running theme in Gothic studies, isn't it? That
Mm.
Gothic is really about play. It's a safe way of playing with these
Mm, mm,
threatening ideas from that exist on the fringes of society, or dealing with
mm,
ideas that are quite uncomfortable. Um,
mm,
so yeah, I think there's definitely that reading in Hound, and Darrell I think brings out quite a lot of that in his introduction as well. So the Oxford World Classics are very good new contributions to the scholarship as well.
mm,
I mean,
mm.
the one thing I would like is I would really like them to be in hardback because
Oh, definitely. We
I like my 93 versions in hardback.
Yeah, and if they could do what they did in '93 as well, issue it in a nice hardback set with a nice presentation display box, that would be even
That
better.
would be even better. That would be lovely. Yeah. I mean, scholarship doesn't sort of end with the printed word, of course. I mean, we're blessed as well that we have more digital resources now
Mm,
as well. And I think one of the highlights that we wanted to focus in on as well was a website that came out earlier this year, which was called An Alpine Walk: Conan Doyle and
mm,
Sherlock
mm,
Holmes in Switzerland. And that was produced by Lawrence Pernet, a researcher who spent some time in the with the papers of the Conan Doyle Foundation in the Bibliothèque Cantonale in Lausanne. And Lawrence produced an absolutely incredible website.
mm, mm. Yeah, I'd recommend anybody to go and have a look at this, and the material that's on there, and wonderful pictures.
Mm.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, and it really does open your mind and your eyes to the Swiss element,
Yeah,
within Conan Doyle's life, and the importance of it.
yeah. It's such a pivotal moment in the story of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes is the Reichenbach Falls, to then be able to see photographs of the time when he was
Mm.
visiting these locations as well. It's a great piece of work, and
And it's always worth revisiting this, the whole issue. We've discussed this before when we were talking about the final problem, but going back to this period, and there's so much mythology accrued around it.
yeah, yeah,
It's always interesting to go back and just chip some of that away,
yes.
and get the story underneath, which, as ever with these things, is far more fascinating than the mythology anyway.
Yes, it is. It is.
Mhm.
And the Alpine Walk website is a good illustration of what is happening generally in with the digitization of
Mm,
collections as well. And recently, Jessie Amalo, who's the curator of the Conan Doyle collection at the Toronto Public Library, you mentioned just before, just reported that all of the correspondence between Conan Doyle and Greenhouse Smith is now available as scans
mm,
online at the website. And people like Tim Johnson at Minnesota continue to do that work. And there was a really very interesting online exhibition back in October that caught my eye from the University of Delaware. And they put online just a handful of treasures from their collection. But they included within it a letter from Conan Doyle to Jesse Drummond, who was a friend from
mm,
Edinburgh days, in which he talks about his difficulties setting up in Southsea, but also makes these casual references to these works that he's got, like Captain of the Pole Star and things like
mm,
that. And then a letter to Stoddart in
mm,
1891, and a letter, I think, to Pond about his 1894 North America tour as well.
mm,
And, the fact that we're getting more of these collections online now
mm,
is such a boon to researchers. If
mm,
you think about the scholarship that went into that, even that 93 edition that we were talking about before, how much harder it was then to be able to get
mm,
hold of this material. And now, you
mm,
know, every week that goes by, more and more material is being made available online. That's
mm.
fantastic.
Well, I mean, think in our interview with Jonathan Cranfield earlier in the year, he made this point about how he was able, when putting together the edition of the memoirs, to go in to newspaper archives.
Yes.
With great reason, and making the point that back in '93, when Christopher Roden was editing the memoirs, he didn't have the opportunity to do this. You actually had to go into the archives themselves. It's becoming easier and becoming wider. Putting it together is just as hard as it ever was.
Yes.
But the actual research element is becoming an easier process.
Yes.
Than it used to be.
Yeah. Actually, while you're on the topic there of newspapers as well, one of the books I'd like to give a shout out to is the latest volume. Well, it was January 23, but it was the latest volume of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers, which comes out from Wessex Press. And they have been doing the spade work of compiling all of those references. It's an astonishing exercise. But it's sort of, again, it's illustrative of how Conan Doyle's popularity grew, that the first volume covered multiple years. And actually, Volume 6 covers 1 month.
Yeah.
October 1894, when he's touring North America. I mean, I have no idea how the editors, Matthias Bostrom and Mark Albasat, are going to cope with future volumes, but I hope they do, because it's a tremendous resource. And actually, in a weird way, just having a volume which is just the press coverage on 1 month itself is astonishing. You get such a rich insight into what is going on. In a way that it would just be really hard otherwise.
And showing the importance of this man to his contemporary audience. It is quite astonishing to see his rise from this kind of Edinburgh obscurity into this worldwide figure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another big sort of tie together of kind of scholarship and the more traditional Sherlockian approach, perhaps, did come at the end of the year with the release of Andrew Lycett's The Worlds of Sherlock Holmes, which we talked to Andrew about in the previous podcast. And in a way, as I say, this is a very traditional book. It's a very attractive, to use that phrase, coffee table book, if you like, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
What Lycett tries to do as well is tie together Sherlockian scholarship with Doyle.
Yeah.
Because of course Andrew Lycett produced one of the cornerstone biographies of Doyle in 2007, and the first one to use the material which had come into awareness after the Christie's sale in 2004. So he had all that background. So you've got this interesting playing about with themes and ideas and tying together Doyle and Sherlock. And it's a very, very commendable book. There are one or two unfortunate slip-ups with facts, which will happen with these kind of books.
Yeah.
But they don't detract this from buying it, because it is a wonderful volume to have. And hopefully there will be future. It's a kind of book that can be updated.
Yeah, and I think it in its in the desire to deal with things thematically as well. It gets to the heart of some really interesting ideas and concepts that run throughout, both the Sherlock Holmes canon, but also Conan Doyle's life. And that sort of knitting together of things is quite tricky to do.
Oh, absolutely. And if there's kind of any other problem with the book that I would point out, is the fact that because, again, the nature of the book, that there's not enough space to explore the themes.
Yes.
To the extent that that they deserve, that could have been done, but because of the actual format, where the pictures are important, take up 4 pages and so on, that the text often suffers because of that, to make the book prettier. But as I say, there's plenty of scope to keep updating and reissuing this.
Yeah. So let's think about some of the events and meetings and related activities that have happened in 2023 as well. And I think right at the beginning of the year was that the wonderful exhibition, Sherlock Holmes and 221 Objects, moved to the University of Minnesota. And this is the collection of treasures from the private archive of Glenn Moranka, which actually launched at the Grolier Club in New York City in January 2022. And it's an absolutely remarkable collection. Glenn's archive has about 8,000 items, and so he had to pick from it 221 that really spoke to him and told a story about Conan Doyle and his relationship with Sherlock Holmes as well. And he covers everything from first appearances to pirate editions and original artwork to, the jaw-dropping for me, the Norwood notebooks. And to see those notebooks and the original manuscript of Dancing Men and things like that as well. But he's managed to pick up a whole range of things like the only surviving salesman's dummy of the Hound of the Baskervilles, hawked around to the various booksellers. But I do think it is quite an amazing thing. And if you don't get a chance to see it, and the catalogue itself is an amazing piece of work. It was written by Glenn and his wife, Kathy, and it actually won the Tony and Frida Howlett Literary Award from the Sherlock Holmes Society of London last year in May as well. So it is definitely worth picking it up if you haven't got a copy and you can't get to the exhibition. And it all plaudits to Glenn for seeing himself as a preserver or a custodian of this work, of this archive, that he actually shares this with other people in this kind of way.
Which doesn't always happen with obviously with some of these precious objects in private hands, which is it's perfectly understandable, but it is wonderful when they are shared and someone is so proud of their collection and knows what to do with it.
Yes.
How to get it displayed, how to really work with this collection and get the most from it and use it, as you've pointed out, as a teaching tool. And with that, what we've been talking about all the way through this podcast so far, I think, is context.
Yeah.
All these things are enriched by context.
Yes.
And you begin to understand the connection between objects, between people, between work. And it just enriches it all.
Yeah. And, Glenn and others have been very generous in sharing their manuscripts and having those reproduced as facsimile editions. And, the accompanying scholarly commentary on those is really about drawing in the context and the connections. I think I was really pleased to hear that actually one of the things in that exhibition, Conan Doyle's handwritten notes for one of his speeches, The Romance of Medicine, is going to come out as a manuscript, as a facsimile edition in 2024. And, we hope very much to be able to have Glenn on the podcast to talk about that, because that's a really significant work in and of itself.
And again, the time he made it, it's another important context piece.
Yes,
in Conan Doyle's life, the progression of different works and the times they appear. This is the other thing that it's a really, really important issue to discuss, and what's going on here with these reproductions of manuscripts and so on. We can begin to understand all this work far better.
Yeah. I mean, talking about private collections, the other thing that 2023 was big for was the number of auctions of material that came onto the market.
And the one which unsurprisingly really caught the public imagination was the Christie's sale of Charlie Watts' collection, which the drummer of the Rolling Stones, who he's when you look through the catalogue, it's astonishing. He had a real eye,
yes,
and was a great collector, and went for the good stuff. And you look at the library. There are only a few items of Conan Doyle, but it really is superlative. What was in there?
The big ticket item, of course, was his first edition of The Hound.
Oh yes,
signed by Conan Doyle with a note saying, "I perambulated Dartmoor before I wrote this book," which I think sold for a tidy £200,000.
£214,200.
Wow, gosh!
The estimate was 70 to 100,000. So it obviously generated some competition amongst other collectors. But as well as this, he had pristine Noon's first editions of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. There was a rare first edition of the Case book with its jacket. But the other item which really caught my eye in this sale was a copy of A Study in Scarlet. It's not a very special looking one. It was a Lippincott's Philadelphia issue, 1890, that had been rebound. But what was really interesting was, again, it's an inscription on the title page with A. Conan Doyle's kindest recollections of pleasant partnership in travel, June the 13th, 91. And this had been given to I think it's two American ladies who travelled with Arthur and Louise. And there's actually a fascinating tintype photograph of the four of them together, which I'd never seen.
No.
Included with this. So this is an actual, an historic artifact. As well as a wonderful collector's piece. So. It's a fascinating auction, and as I say, the Conan Doyle was only a fraction. Absolutely wonderful jacketed firsts of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, beautiful editions. But there's always, to me, certainly a sadness with this, seeing this carefully curated collection being broken up. And particularly items like that where you've got these runs of beautiful first editions, which it's a shame. I mean, some of them, as you've pointed out with Glenn Naranka's collection, go to collectors who will then allow some sort of public access.
That's right. And I think also, there are people like Randall Stock, who runs the Best of Sherlock website, bestofsherlock.com, which and Randall is doing a very good job of sort of keeping tabs as much as possible on where these things go and where they exist, particularly manuscript editions as well, because I think that's so important. And I think one of the things that we found in creating this podcast is that often these catalogues are great sources for information as well. And there was an auction back in April, the Robert Hess collection, which had some really interesting things in there, including letters from Joseph Bell, some of Conan Doyle's spiritualist correspondence from the 20s, papers relating to Dickie Doyle. And I see that the second of the Robert Hess auctions is in February 2024 and includes items from Roy Pilot's collection. And within that is the manuscript of Uncle Bernac. And that would be a fascinating one to look at as well, simply because it was, I don't think Conan Doyle was ever all that happy with Bernac, and quite a lot of chopping and changing going on.
Well, exactly where you were talking earlier about with the Hound of the Baskervilles, you can see the joins. Bernac would be particularly interesting in this way, to see the manuscript and knowing that Doyle was unhappy with it, and it is very much a novel of two parts, if not three, that's just been chopped together, and Doyle was never happy with the end result, and parts of it read like a list rather than a novel. It would be fascinating to actually look at the manuscript and see. I know Doyle's manuscripts often don't have crossings out and changings, but to see where things do change.
I would have thought this one does. There are some of the Gerard manuscripts where there's like a half page missing, so you do wonder. I mean, not all the manuscripts sort of fared well last year. I think Brocas Court was up for auction in September, and didn't meet the reserve. So, but again, it's a kind of lesser work, and I suspect Bernac will find a home, and let's hope that it finds a home with somebody who can turn it into a facsimile edition.
No, absolutely.
Find out what happened to it. The other thing that happened this last year is that there were plenty of conferences, and one that I was really hoping to be able to go to was the Reichenbacher Regulars Conference in May, but unfortunately I wasn't able to go. But fingers crossed they will be able to publish the papers from that conference in the same way as they did with fairly recently with previous conferences as well. But there's also been sort of obviously a growth in recent years, particularly post pandemic, of online conferences, and there are a couple that I think are real anchor events of the year that is worth people attending if they possibly can. And the great thing is you can go back and attend these if you miss them the first time round. So back in September, the BSI Trust, which sort of preserves the story of the Baker Street Irregulars as an organisation, had a presentation from Steve Rothman on Christopher Morley and Edgar Smith, two of the great foundational figures, and about their relationship and how they were there at the sort of genesis of what today is sort of Sherlockian publishing. And then back in November, there was the Cameron Hollier lecture for the Friends of the Conan Doyle Collection at Toronto Public Library, which last year was given by Dana Richards on The Fires of Fate, the play of Tragedy of the Crosco, which and Dana was really focusing in there on the depiction of a particular medical condition and whether Conan Doyle was playing fast and loose with the public in the way in which he, was he being irresponsible with the public in the way that he handled this information, which I think is really fascinating. And it actually came up in a very recent online event that I was fortunate enough to be involved with, the Literary Agents meeting. We just had the January 24 one a few weeks ago, and this whole idea of Conan Doyle as being a medic and being a literary figure, and what the tensions between the two really came out in the discussion there with the panel, but also with Roger Luckhurst, who edited the Round the Red Lamp for the Edinburgh edition as well.
Yeah, when you mentioned the Edgar Smith and Christopher Morley discussion, I mean, this is another area. I'm sure will really develop into a full area of scholarship over time, in the fullest sense, with the context of Doyle and Sherlock Holmes studied by people of that caliber.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, the context, the literary context of somebody like Morley.
Yes. Yeah.
Who too many people, is just associated with Sherlock Holmes in many minds now.
Yes. Yeah.
But you've got this whole literary hinterland with him.
Yes.
That all ties into it's the world of Doyle and Sherlock reaching out, Moriarty like with the tentacles in other worlds, and I really feel that this is somewhere that the whole subject is going to move towards in the future.
Yes, I mean Starrett as well with the work of Ray Metzner as well.
Yeah.
I mean the there's a lot of really excellent scholarship already out there, and I think you're right. It's waiting for its time to be sort of discovered by more of a mainstream. The other event, online event that is worth just giving a mention to is the Worldwide Doyle series, which comes out of the Portsmouth City Libraries, and that takes place in June, July each year. It started again, I think, during the pandemic, and it's continued since then. And at Doings of Doyle, we're happy to host the recordings of those events on the YouTube site, and we'll put a link to those. This year we had talks on supernatural stories of Conan Doyle by Brian Woods. We had Sidney Paget's visions of Sherlock Holmes by Chris Pittard. Michael Gunton, the curator of the Richard Lansell and Green bequest, was also able to talk about the collection, what's in it, and how it came about. And then there was a rather more flippant piece by myself and Ross Davies of the ACD Society on Conan Doyle's somewhat disastrous involvement with a sculpturing machine company. But one of the nice things to think about recent years is that, we have had more of these online events. We are now able to connect more as a community of aficionados and scholars, and to take part in these events remotely and go back and review them.
Another way of getting kind of different subjects into the public eye that you can obviously do through articles and essays, but this is another way of doing it, and obviously more visual. And again, as I was watching yours and Ross's presentation on the sculpting machine, your own mind goes along the lines of, oh well, here would be another big project for someone. Conan Doyle and his love of gadgets and mad inventions.
Oh, yes.
There's a whole book in there as well. I mean, this is the thing you constantly get with Doyle, and why he himself was so frustrated by being tied to Sherlock so much is his breadth of interests.
Yeah. Well, that nicely takes us to the kind of last section that we want to really talk about, which is our sort of stage and screen. And in particular, the sort of the real big ticket item of last year on the non-fiction side was a new documentary, Killing Sherlock, Lucy Worsley on the Case of Conan Doyle, which came out in December. And, I think I was really pleased to see that this come to the BBC. It was great to actually see that we would get so much airtime. I was trying to track back through previous versions of documentaries on Conan Doyle, and they're either on different aspects of his life, or they've been just on Sherlock Holmes rather than Conan Doyle. And, you have to go back quite a long way, over 10 years, before you get anything really substantial in this space. So it's good that you finally get, 3 hours of primetime television devoted to his life. So to actually, delve into all manner of things from, cars and clubs and bodybuilding to, his interest in social justice and, his fascination with war service and things like that. But I do think it was not without its problems as a documentary. This is for a general audience. This is not for the people who, not for you or I, or for people who will listen to this podcast, I'm sure. But to sort of hook people, there is this artifice of Lucy Worsley discovering things, and that sometimes really got up my nose, it has to be said. But leaving aside the sort of making of modern documentaries, I think there was also a wider problem in that the core premise was really that Conan Doyle was constantly, throughout his life, overshadowed by Sherlock Holmes, and that this became a kind of roadblock to respectability. And that led to some quite odd assertions in the documentary, and they had to make some quite large leaps. So at one point, we were told that, Conan Doyle investigated the Eaglety case because he wanted to outshine Sherlock Holmes, or that, he wanted to demonstrate bravery on the battlefield, to step out of the shadow of Sherlock Holmes. And those were the particularly egregious bits of the documentary for me. They were the bits that really did rankle, because, it requires you to take a particular view of Conan Doyle, which I don't think is really backed up by the evidence.
Well, in particular, I mean, where you talk there about this Conan Doyle wanting to prove his bravery on the battlefield. It's nothing to do with that, is it? His entry into the Boer War, he was at a particularly difficult point in his life, and the war came up, and it wasn't that he wanted to become a soldier and cover himself in glory. It's a change of scene, and allied with his sense of patriotism and duty. More than anything with that, which was why he was disappointed when he was rejected for the army on grounds of inexperience and age. But as soon as he got the ability to work with the Langman Hospital, he was happy to go out as a doctor, which he was obviously trained and experienced. He wasn't. The sense was given that he was a glory seeker in this way, and that's just not true. It's just not. It's far more complex than that. He was far more interesting and intelligent than that. It just didn't present a true picture. It in fact, skewed the picture.
Yeah.
Which, as you say, is egregious. Some of what they were doing. I mean, particularly, again, tied into the Boer War section, the idea that really irritated me was this that he was hankering for knighthood.
Yes.
Essentially, and that's just wrong. He wanted to refuse it. And felt, his mother told him he couldn't refuse it, and he felt duty bound to the new king. To accept the knighthood, and then years later he takes the opportunity to have Sherlock Holmes refuse a knighthood at exactly the same time. Summer 1902. It's very pointed. So this idea that he was hankering after honours, it's just not true.
I mean, I think one of the things that she really hits on in this documentary is the idea that Conan Doyle sought respect, and
Mm,
I can see a lot of that in
mm,
his life. The peculiar thing is, I think it's kind of the right argument and the wrong evidence, in the sense that I think you can sort of argue that he was seeking respect probably up to about 1900.
mm,
I think it's harder to argue that case after 1900 when he's more of an establishment figure and he's more recognized. And he does have a knighthood, but he's not pursuing it. But I think the other
mm.
thing about it is that seeking respect does come a lot from his background, from the fact
Oh
that
yeah.
he is, from the cadet branch of a famous, respected London literary family. He's from a
Mm,
relatively impoverished background. And I think a piece that doesn't come out in the documentary, but I do think is fundamental to his psyche, is that he's Scottish. There's an interesting thing about the fact that he adopts Englishness in such a way and becomes so synonymous with it
and
that
and
actually,
and not just Scots Irish.
yeah, exactly, yeah,
Obviously, within a format of this kind, with the program, you can't go into depth. So you can't go into the full background and the fact that his grandfather John Doyle, the great caricaturist who knew all the great and the good of his time, had actually come over from Ireland and made his way as an artist,
yeah, yeah,
and had brought the family into respectability. And it's one of the great telling facts of Doyle's life that one of the things he was proud of was he had that dinner table
yes,
that had belonged to his grandfather, which
yes,
all the great and the good of the time, the Duke of Wellington, Thackeray, that all sat round this table.
mm, mm,
And in a way, you feel that Arthur was wanting to get the family back to that, and he did.
yeah, yeah. Yes, and so I think there's the core of something correct there,
Mm,
but
mm,
you have to be really careful with how you present things. So you'd be forgiven for watching that and thinking that A Study in Scarlet was the first book that Conan Doyle wrote,
mm.
or that The Hound of the Baskervilles is Conan Doyle scratching an itch to write Gothic fiction when in fact he's got 2 decades of it before then.
Yes, he's
So
constantly writing it.
yeah, so
It's throughout his career.
you get some weird things appearing in this documentary that just don't quite hang together.
Mm,
But I think there is something laudable in trying to bring a wider view of Conan Doyle to the public than you would
mm,
normally get. I would also say that actually I thought that the expert contributions were really, really good. I thought that actually, when you
It
actually
was
brought in the experts, there were some great contributions. There was a wonderful piece about um, the Boer War and concentration camps. There was also a very good piece, I think, on forensics, and also
true.
that interesting connection about the way in which psychics perform and the sort of deductive methods of Sherlock Holmes. Lots of nice connections being made
Mm,
between things.
mm,
And I kind of would have liked the experts to have been let off the leash a bit and
yes.
to talk more around their subject. Because, people like Dan Stashauer's on there. He's incredibly knowledgeable about Houdini
Mm,
and about magic and about that spiritualist phase of Conan Doyle's life. But we only
mm,
get, the soundbite fragment of
mm.
from the experts at any one point in time, which is, I think to the detriment.
One of the other points, and again, this ties into Doyle's interest in the supernatural and so on, that was missed out in the Lucy Worsley program mysteriously was the Cottingley Fairies
Mm,
incident, which we've again covered on the podcast before, but it's central
yeah,
to the public perception of Doyle in the 1920s, and the whole area was missing here. And obviously, it also, some of the background that his father Charles and his uncle Richard were both painters of fairies and both very, very much involved with the kind of Victorian version of the fairies, which
yeah,
is what the Cottingley Fairies were.
yeah,
So it just felt to me that there was a big gap there. But again, it is this problem is it, as you point out, it's not aimed at people like us.
no.
But I think the general public's imagination would certainly have been captured by use of the Cottingley
Oh,
Fairies.
yeah. I mean that is, I think, the one bit in the argument around respect and respectability that is peculiarly missing from the documentary,
Mm,
because it
mm,
actually makes essentially Conan Doyle destroys his reputation in a very
mm,
short period of time, and that carries through into views of his literature and other contributions to society for the next 8-9 years.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
it's an odd one to have missed out, but I'd be fascinated to know why that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get on to the other big ticket item in terms of television, it's worth saying that there was also an excellent stage production in
Yes.
2023 as well that we were lucky enough to both go and see.
Yes, this is Black Eye Theatre's adaptation, written by Nick Lane, of The Valley of Fear. Now, a few years ago, I certainly got to see their version of Sign of Four,
Yeah.
which was absolutely wonderful. This lived up to it,
Mm.
and it's fascinating. I won't give too much away because it's still on tour. But Lane takes the Valley of Fear, and instead of using the Doyle structure of Sherlock, flashback Sherlock, he's constantly intercutting the two stories together, and it just worked beautifully.
Yeah.
The narrative flow was excellent. And the other thing I will say about this production, and as I say, if it comes near you, do go and see it, is it takes Sherlock Holmes seriously.
Yes, it does.
It would be great to see Nick Lane and Black Eye Theatre take the Hand of the Baskervilles and turn it back into a Gothic chiller,
Yeah.
which they could do, and it'd be absolutely wonderful to see that done, and to restore it to its correct place. But yeah, great stuff.
I did think that their adaptation was particularly well done because that intercutting of the two stories is made all the harder by the revelation as to who is Birdie Edwards.
Yeah.
And they managed it fantastically. I mean,
Yep.
that is a neat bit of magic trick right there. Very good. So so that was on stage, and then on screen, the thing that ended the year was the Ghost Story for Christmas adaptation.
Yes. Now, before we actually get on to this, I'd just like to mention a book which came out earlier in the year, Conan Doyle Mystery and Adventure, written by our very own Mark Jones, which was an in-depth examination of the up to this point, really, the forgotten 1967 series of Conan Doyle stories, which were adapted for television by John Hawkesworth, who, of course, went on to the Granada series from 1984 onwards. But this was a series which took some of those Gothic stories we've been talking about, the non-Sherlockian Gothic stories, and adventure stories, and produced individual plays of them. The reason we don't know about this is, unfortunately, most of them in that classic late 60s, early 70s BBC way have been wiped.
Yes.
We have one surviving, don't we, Mark, which is
Mystery of Cadarifan, which is based on Surgeon of Gasterfell.
But the rest, unfortunately, have been lost. But Mark has been delving in the archives of was it the BFI?
Yeah, the BFI and the BBC,
and the Hawkesworth papers there, and found out an awful lot about this series. And again, I do recommend this.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely wholeheartedly, because it's filling a gap that most of us didn't even know about, and it's wonderful. And again, where I've been talking about context an awful lot in this show, the context of the Granada series is widened by knowledge of this series. So well done, and thanks, Mark,
thank you for that,
producing that. And on the back of that, I'd just also like to mention Kaleidoscope, who've published Mark's book. I've also done a long-awaited and much-needed reissue of David Stuart Davis's classic book, Bending the Willow.
Yes.
Which is his personal reflection on the Granada series. Absolutely brilliant book. Came out first in 1996. Hasn't been reissued enough, but fortunately we have a very nice production job done here from Kaleidoscope. And again, highly recommended. If you don't have a copy of this book, you must.
Yeah, it's absolutely essential, isn't it? It is. It really is. You very nicely mentioned there the Conan Doyle Mystery and Adventure book, and actually the first episode of that series adapted by Hawkesworth was lot number 249, and here we have it adapted again, this time by Mark Gatiss for the Ghost Story for Christmas slot, which has been a bit of a sort of, well, on and off mainstay of British television, I suppose, if you can be an on and off mainstay, in that it was there in the 70s with adaptations of the works of M.R. James by Lawrence Gordon Clark, and Mark Gatiss took on the mantle fairly recently. I really enjoyed this adaptation. I thought that it had a lot going for it. And Gatiss was able to do something that I think Hawksworth did back in 67, which was to go back to the original text and, where possible, remain faithful to it. And then also to draw out some of the themes that he was particularly interested in exploring.
As we discussed in our episode on lot number 249, there's this, Gatiss is bringing out the subjects which are there, in a way hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
The kind of the homoeroticism.
Yes. Yeah.
Which you can say is there in the original, and this is, interestingly, when it was first published before the Oscar Wilde trial. So this stuff's bubbling under the surface, as well as the old favourite, the central Imperial Gothic.
Yes.
Is certainly there in the original, and it's just brought out in slightly different take, shall we say, that Gatiss has on these issues than Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah.
But they both work.
Yeah. We have to also mention that we are fortunate enough to know the chap who played the mummy in this, in this adaptation. James Swanton is a friend of ours, and he very diligently did not tell us anything about the production at all. So it genuinely came as a complete revelation to watch it on Christmas Eve. But I was really pleased to see that they did the whole mummy running sequence, because that is terrifying in the story, and it worked really, really well on television as well. But the sort of major change that happened in the story was that there was the introduction of a certain detective who was looking for rooms at Baker Street at the time.
And asking that no ghosts apply, please.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
But I thought that worked very nicely.
Yeah.
And it is one point of the original story where the kind of advisory character is a doctor, and I've always felt, when I've read the story, I would actually change him into a priest rather than a doctor. So to have this further change, which I thought, that works very nicely. It's a bit of fun, it just fitted in to the format very nicely. It didn't jar. Unlike, we for those who haven't seen it yet, we can't give too much away, really. But the ending certainly jarred with me.
Yes.
It was Mark Gatiss pulling the same trick he tried with the mezzo tint earlier on, M.R. James's The Mezzo Tint, and it didn't work in that either. And I don't feel it worked here. I thought it just, it turned the story on its head right at the end in a way that I don't think worked. But that's me. That's a personal view.
Yeah. And I am really hopeful that actually this could be the opening for more adaptations of Conan Doyle's non-Sherlockian work on television, because I think what it does show is that the source material is still good enough to produce good television now.
And it's a lot of it, as with Imperial Gothic and so on. It's touching on themes that we're interested in now.
Yeah,
it's the joy of so much Conan Doyle. He does speak to the contemporary.
Yeah,
which is probably why the one area of his work that's most neglected is the historical novels, because they tend not to.
Yes,
but Holmes and the Gothic stories, they are timeless.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think 2023 was a really big year for Conan Doyle studies, and it looks set to continue. We apologise to anybody if we missed anything major. With the amount of Conan Doyle related work that was going on in 2023, it's really hard to stay abreast of it, which in a way is a positive thing.
Yes.
But if you want to recommend anything that you saw or you experienced or you thought was particularly good in 2023, then please drop by the website and drop a comment on the episode webpage. We'd love to hear what you enjoyed in 2023. So we're getting to the end of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, please leave us a rating or review on the podcaster of your choice, or consider becoming a patron on Patreon or PayPal. You can find out more at the website. So, Paul, next time we're going back to our regular programming. What do we have in store for listeners?
We're going back to the Napoleonic period again for the next episode, which is the novella The Great Shadow It's a wonderful piece of adventure fiction and battle narrative.
Yes.
It's a gem which is overlooked a lot. So it would be great fun to explore it in some detail.
Yes, and we might end up touching on Ridley Scott at some point.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Lane takes the value of 4, and instead of its structure of...
So you said the value of 4, you said?
I did say the value of 4. There's the outtake.
There you go.